Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento and welcome to this episode. If you're joining in for the very first time, welcome. The goal of this show is to share lessons that I've learned from the field, insights that I've gathered from working with customers who are implementing SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solutions. Mistakes, both my customers and mine. I am not excusing myself. I made mistakes. Yes, I'm sorry. Sorry. It's starting to sound like a Canadian. But mistakes that I've made personally and lessons I've learned from those mistakes. It's great to make mistakes, so long as you treat them as learning experience. Part of that is also trying to simplify things as much as I can, because deploying high availability and disaster recovery solutions are already complex. Plus, practical. I'm pragmatic. I'm practical. I imagine myself as the one spending on these deployment projects and implementation projects, that I think of ways on how not to spend a lot of money while also making sure that I am actually solving the real problem. I want to introduce a new segment, or I don't want to say segment, but maybe a tag. You know how it is when you start tagging your files so that you can identify what those files are? Sometimes when you're tagging photos or videos or anything, kind of like file management. I want to introduce a tag. I can call it tag. You can call it tag, call it whatever you want. But it's just a way of me identifying some of these things that I've shared that were from, let's just say, customer lessons. Names have been omitted, removed to protect the innocent. I call these lessons from the field. And, well, again, lessons from the field because they are experiences and lessons that I've gained from customers implementing always-on availability groups, SQL Server high availability solutions, or high availability and disaster recovery solutions in general. Not necessarily SQL Server, but again, any type of high availability and disaster recovery solution. And from a holistic point of view, meaning we're not just looking at the database, we're looking at the entire infrastructure end to end. That's why I want to call this lesson, or I want to call this series, Lessons from the Field. I am going to introduce them into upcoming episodes, not necessarily in sequence, right? Because sometimes I get feedback from people who have been watching some of the episodes suggesting, hey, we're having difficulty or having challenges on this specific topic. Can you talk more about that? It's, again, as a data professional, I look at trends and I look at patterns, and sometimes I analyze the topics that are more popular than others. Why don't I go ahead and start off with this week's topic? I call them successful deployments. Okay, customer stories about always-on availability groups implementation. And start off there. There are cases when a customer would bring me in because their implementation was not successful, the project is being delayed, and it's taking them longer than what they planned for when it comes to implementing always-on availability groups. And every once in a while, I get brought in to spearhead the implementation from start to finish. And in some cases, I get brought in to evaluate, second pair of eyes, to review their existing infrastructure, do health checks, and look for gaps. And whenever I do the health checks, the environment review, I would come across customer implementations where, despite the complexity, despite the scale of their implementation, I'm blown away because they have done it really well. I'm not saying you copy exactly what they did. All I'm saying is I want to share with you some of the lessons that they've shared with me and some of the things that they've learned along the way. It's not smooth sailing, but this is exactly one of the reasons why it's great to learn from those who have already done it, and making sure that you're taking as many lessons as you can and implementing them according to whatever your needs are. So again, names of customers have been removed. to protect the innocent. Or in this case, they're successful, but my hands are tied. I cannot talk about the customer specifically, but I can talk about their implementations and the general gist of what they did to come up with not just a successful implementation, but also rock solid. It's working great to a point where they don't even recognize that they have an always-on availability group. I want to share with you 3 lessons that they've shared with me on how they made their always-on availability group implementations successful. Let's start with the first one. The first one is teams involvement. There's a reason I said team and not teams. Okay? Teams involvement. More often than not, DBAs or database administrators will be given the responsibility to implement always-on availability group solutions. And sometimes you have a team, a DBA team of 4, 3, depending on how large your implementation is, 4 DBAs, 5 DBAs within the DBA team. But I did mention here, it's teams involvement, meaning people outside of the DBA team. Sure, you want to get all the members of your DBA team involved because they're the ones not only who will eventually implement the always-on available group solution, but they will be responsible for care and feeding and administration, management, monitoring, and so on and so forth. The challenge here is the fact that always-on availability groups are complex. There's a lot of moving parts. Even when you look at a standalone SQL Server instance, you look at your database. You got your database sitting on top of SQL Server, and SQL Server sitting on top of the Windows Server operating system. And then your server operating system is sitting on top of either a physical machine, whether it's bare metal installation, or a virtual machine, which sit on top of a hypervisor. When you introduce your databases or when you introduce always-on availability groups in the mix, now you're looking at things outside of SQL Server that everything relies on. Now your database sits on top of an availability group. Your availability groups sit on top of SQL Server. Your SQL Server sits on top of a Windows Server failover cluster. Your Windows Server failover cluster sits on top of the Windows Server operating system. And again, now that you have Windows Server failover clustering in the mix, in addition to Windows Server operating system running on top of a bare metal machine, a physical machine, virtual machine, public cloud infrastructures, now we're relying on stuff like Active Directory, DNS, networking, and your underlying storage if you're implementing some sort of enterprise storage subsystem. So get every team's, plural, every team's involved who would be responsible for not just building the always-on availability group, because that's going to be the database administrators, but responsible for contributing to how the always-on availability group is built from the ground up. Involve every team responsible for specific tasks as early as possible. So for instance, you bring the VM team if your Windows Server operating systems are going to be running on top of virtual machines. Bring them over. Get them involved. Okay? And let them see the bigger picture. Okay? It's not enough for virtual VM admins to just provision VMs. Okay? You have to let them know that now, especially if most of the time they've been deploying standalone instances, and now they will be deploying Windows Server failover clusters with always-on availability groups. They have to be aware that there is more to it than just provisioning a virtual machine. Okay, stuff like anti-affinity. You don't want, if it's a 2-node failover cluster with the 2 replica availability groups, you don't want both VMs to end up on the same physical host. So stuff like anti-affinity, stuff like over-provisioning and vNUMA configuration, or assigning memory and virtual CPU cores, making sure that it is in alignment with what the underlying physical machine that the hypervisor runs on top of. They have to be aware of that. You have to let your Windows sysadmin, particularly your Active Directory people, because now building a Windows Server failover cluster relies on having Active Directory computer objects involved. They have to grant permissions. Same thing with the listener name. You have to bring in the networking guys because now you're deploying multiple machines that act as a single unit. You don't want them to be deploying firewall rules that could potentially prevent communication across the failover cluster, across the available group replicas to fail. Again, bring the different teams involved. I couldn't count the number of times when, because of large organizations where you have segregation of duties, what ends up happening is that the DBA team will just tell the VM team, hey, we need VMs. The DBA team will tell the sysadmins, hey, we need Windows Server operating systems and we need a failover cluster. But not showing and not giving these different teams a bigger picture. They need to know exactly how the different components work together, not just in a silo. And again, the challenge with working with large enterprises where you have segregation of duties, every team is siloed. And so what the VM team might be doing is exactly what they've done for the other implementation, not realizing, hey, this VM does not need to be on the same host as the other VM that is part of the failover cluster. This VM should be properly configured when it comes to vCPU cores and the amount of RAM. Again, get every team's involved. The customers that I've worked with where they have really good implementation, meaning the availability groups are rock solid, the databases are highly available, failover clusters are fine, virtual machines are fine. And I asked them, so how did you end up having a rock solid implementation? A common pattern across these customers is the fact they got every single one of these teams involved, outside of the DBA team, that is. They got them involved, okay? And every single team that is responsible for performing a task that requires building the availability group from the ground up. So it's not just the DBA's responsibility, and oftentimes it is kind of difficult to work with external teams if you're siloed. And the DBA team is now responsible to figure things out, not realizing, hey, I don't have permissions to do that. And by the way, I cannot do that because it's outside the scope of my responsibility. I'm not supposed to do that because of security and compliance requirements. But they're just relying on the other teams to do what they have been doing to provision what resources are necessary to build an availability group without them really understanding the bigger picture. The important thing here is let them see the bigger picture and how each component work together to achieve high availability for your SQL Server databases. Again, it's not enough for you to tell the VM admins, give us VMs. It's not enough for you to tell the sysadmins, give us a failover cluster. They need to know, right? They need to know. Even with requesting for storage, it's not enough for you to request for capacity. You have to request for performance, meaning throughput and IOPS, and making sure that the storage that you will be provided for your databases are enough, okay, to accommodate the workload that you're going to put into when you build up your availability group. So that's the first one. Teams involvement. And not just the database administration team, but teams that would be a part, doing their respective responsibilities and respective tasks to build the always-on available group from the ground up. So that's the first one. The second one is to break down components into smaller chunks. I've given you kind of like a high-level overview of how your availability groups and the databases and every single components work. Let's start off with your databases. Your databases, when you implement an availability group, will now sit on top of your databases will now sit on top of an availability group. Your availability groups sit on top of SQL Server. Your SQL Server sits on top of a Windows Server operating system. Oh, and by the way, in order for your availability groups to be highly available, they need to sit on top of a Windows Server failover cluster. And now that you have a Windows Server failover cluster, you need to rely on Active Directory. You need to rely on DNS for the computer name object for the failover cluster, for the listener name of the availability group. You need to rely on networking because the traffic that goes to and from the different nodes and the different replicas, and then not to mention if the machine happens to be a virtual machine, you have to consider that you have to break down components into smaller chunks. I've seen so many cases, and this is one thing that I've seen, kind of like a pattern. Every customer I've worked with who had successful implementations, they kind of summarized it this way: simplify. Okay, and how do you simplify? You break down components into smaller chunks. I don't know about you, but I've seen so many videos, tutorials, examples, articles of experts building always-on available groups where they would use the wizard. And Microsoft made it so easy to open up the wizard, click, 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 next, and you're done. Okay? Anybody who knows how to click next and provide parameter values in a wizard can build an always-on available group without really knowing what's going on underneath. These customers who have successfully implemented always-on availability groups rolled it out in production. It's stable and reliable. The one thing that they told me, and it's similar across all of these customers, is this: you break down components into smaller chunks. So it's not just, hey, we will fire up an availability group using the wizard. We will create an availability group using the wizard, click next, 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 and finish. Simple and easy as that may seem, the wizard made it so easy. Microsoft made it so easy, but we don't really see what's going on under the covers. It's just like, hey, we have this nice and shiny thing, we're giving it to you, and at the end of it, you can do whatever you want with it. What these customers have done is they broke down components into smaller chunks. One example of this, excuse me, they had been given a go signal to implement always-on availability groups. Again, database, availability group, failover cluster, SQL Server, Windows Server operating system, VM, Active Directory, DNS. So they broke it down into smaller pieces. Okay. Now that they have broken it down into smaller pieces, they know the different moving parts. And because they know the different moving parts, they can now excuse me, get into, wow, my throat is so dry. They can now move on to number 3. Okay. Because they broke down complex components into smaller chunks, they've simplified it, they were able to assign these components to the different teams and then proceeded to build those components accordingly as prerequisites arise. What do I mean by that? There are certain prerequisites when you're building always-on availability groups. Like, for instance, on the database level, those databases need to be in full recovery model. You need to take at least one full database backup. Sure, I'll leave that to the database administration team. You also need to make sure that you have turned on the always-on availability groups feature inside SQL Server. So when you open up SQL Server Configuration Manager, open up the SQL Server service, there is a tab there that says always-on availability group. It's a checkbox. But understanding that SQL Server and always-on availability groups rely on Windows Server failover clustering for high availability, they would say, hey, we are not going to turn that feature on until we have a failover cluster already built. Okay, and so they would wait for the Windows sysadmins to build the Windows Server failover cluster, and after that, that's the only time that they would turn the feature on and build the always-on availability group. Not only that, simplifying it and again breaking it down, the Windows sysadmins will then talk to the domain admins and say, hey, we don't have permissions to create computer objects in Active Directory when building our Windows Server failover cluster. They would go ahead and raise a ticket requests for permissions to those computer objects in Active Directory. The AD guys would then do it. So you see how the prerequisites go. And I'm moving backwards in this case. Okay. Now that they have the permissions to build computer object in Active Directory, Windows sysadmins can go ahead and create the failover cluster. But that's not even that. Other than Active Directory, DNS, networking, the sysadmins will then go ahead and ask the network admins, hey, can you create a firewall rule exemption in the firewall rule to prevent blocks for 3343 so that these servers can talk to each other. Just like the DBAs would request a firewall rule exemption for 5022 for the network admins to not have any firewall rule blocking 5022 for inter-replica communication traffic. Same thing, the Windows sysadmin will request the VM admins, hey, can you provision virtual machines for us so that we can build a failover cluster? Okay. Now that they've broken down components into smaller chunks, it's easier, and I say easier, to assign those tasks and those components with their corresponding tasks to those different teams. You got to match the prerequisites with the teams. And here's the thing, avoid the temptation to implement ahead of prerequisites. That's one of the reasons why the first thing is to let them see the bigger picture. Seeing the bigger picture allows every teams that are involved in building the always on available groups see the sequence of events and therefore not jump into building something that requires a certain prerequisite. And this is something that also frustrates me when a SQL Server 2017 was introduced. You can now build an always on availability group without a failover cluster. I don't even know why they call it availability groups. The fact that you said it's availability, the name availability is there assumes, I would assume that what I'm building is highly available. Okay. In SQL Server 2017, Microsoft allowed you to create what is called as read scale availability groups. You can check the box, enable the feature without Windows Server failover clustering, which then makes you wonder, why is it not highly available? Well, because you enabled the feature without turning the prerequisite on first. Because now anybody can make that mistake where I can turn the feature on, oh, and by the way, I need failover cluster. Build the failover cluster and then realize, hey, how come this isn't working? That's because, again, as the DBA team turned on the feature, they've gone ahead and implemented the feature even before the prerequisite is turned on. This is, again, one of those things where you really have to understand, number one, what are you trying to achieve in the first place? Why are you implementing availability groups? Is it for high availability? Because if it is, well, you got to make sure that the failover cluster is there first before you even turn the feature on, because nobody's stopping you now from turning the feature on even without the Windows Server failover cluster. Prior to SQL Server 2017, you cannot. Meaning, I will not be able to check that box until I have a Windows Server failover cluster. But SQL Server 2017 allowed you to do that, which caused a lot of headaches. So even if there's that feature that you can turn on without Windows Server failover clustering, be clear. Now that you've again, from lesson number 2, now that you've managed to break down components into smaller chunks, simpler chunks, you can now match those prerequisites or tasks with the responsible team. So for instance, again, one of my prerequisites for building a highly available, always on availability group, yes, I know it's redundant, one of my prerequisites is to make sure that I have the Windows Server failover clustering first. One of my prerequisites for building a Windows Server failover cluster is to make sure that my servers are joined to Active Directory, because you can build a Windows Server failover cluster without Active Directory with Windows Server 2016 onwards. Again, the goal is high availability. You want to make sure that all those prerequisites are there first, and the teams responsible for for implementing those tasks need to understand that something goes before what they're trying to do and not jump into doing that first. Again, it's tempting. And these customers that have successfully implemented always on availability groups, they follow a sequence of events based on the prerequisites that they need to do in order to achieve a successful implementation of their always on availability groups. And again, a lot of these things, even with provisioning VMs, most of the time customers would think, oh, it's easy to provision a VM, create a template, assign vCPU cores and memory, and that's it. Not really. Until you understand what the workload profile is for the underlying SQL Server instance, the database transactions, and mapping that and matching that with what compute, like virtual CPU and virtual RAM requirements are needed, you might end up causing more issues, which could potentially cause outages. Okay, so again, making sure that you, once you've broken down the components into smaller chunks, you match those tasks, the prerequisite tasks, with the different teams involved, and avoid the temptation of implementing ahead of prerequisites. And it's very easy to do that now. And again, thanks to Microsoft for allowing some of these features to be available to you despite not implementing a prerequisite. I try as much as possible. And again, even telling customers, if your goal is high availability, then you need to have a Windows Server failover cluster. I just wish that Microsoft did not name read scale availability groups as availability. They could have named it something else. But I'm not a marketing guy, so probably not a good source of information when it comes to naming teams. So those are the three things, though. 3 lessons, I call them lessons from the field. 3 lessons that we can learn from customers who have successfully deployed always-on availability groups. Their insights, their lessons learned, and what they did in order for them to, again, not just have a stable, reliable, rock-solid, and highly available infrastructure, but what can we learn from them, and what lessons can we use, implement within our own teams or your own teams in order for your availability groups to be successful. Because again, the last thing you want is you're doing the work, you've implemented the solution, but it's taking longer because you're trying to solve issues even before you roll it out in production. Okay, so the first one is teams involvement. Get the other teams involved, okay, who are responsible for performing different tasks, and let them see the bigger picture. Okay, because most of the times they would just do the work because they don't really understand the bigger picture. Okay, they are more than willing to help. They are happy. They would be glad to make sure that you can do your work. They're more than happy to lend a hand, but they need to see the bigger picture. Okay. The second one is breaking down components into smaller chunks. Might be a bigger implementation, but you break it down into smaller chunks. Helps you, the DBA, the project manager, the different teams involved to understand what those responsibilities are assigned to them, and then eventually you are going to match those prerequisites with teams. Now, I know I've alluded on the fact that somebody really needs to know what is going on, meaning end to end, top to bottom. Okay, somebody, and that somebody is you, whether you're the SQL Server DBA or a sysadmin who's now being given the responsibility to take charge of deploying an always-on available group. That is you, meaning you need to know exactly every single component involved in an availability group. So your databases, SQL Server, always-on availability groups, Windows Server failover cluster, the Windows Server operating system, be it virtual machines or physical machines, Active Directory, networking, DNS, the whole 9 yards, storage, and gallons and liters of coffee along the way. But you have to know exactly how that works, because it's difficult to bring different teams on board and get them involved if you don't know which team is responsible for what. Not mention what needs to be done, right? So there should be somebody responsible for taking care or understanding every single component and how it makes up an always-on availability group. All right, that is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HIDR show. Tune in again next week. And again, this, I started what I call the Lessons from the Field series. Not necessarily something that I would do every week, but every time that I would get some lessons from customers, and I feel like this is something that everybody should do and everybody should benefit from. I'm gonna highlight the fact that this is part of the Lessons from the Field series. And if you need help, whether you're in the process or what most Canadians would say process, whether you're in the process of building an always-on available group, you're thinking of deploying it into production, or you were given the mandate from your executive team, hey, we want high availability for our SQL Server databases. You drive, meaning you're responsible for everything, okay? Or maybe you already have an always-on available groups, but it's causing you a lot of headaches with pain and problems and issues that you have to troubleshoot, or you need a second pair of eyes to do a quick evaluation or a health check of your availability group, or getting your team ready because it's already in production. Somebody built it, but your team's not capable of maintaining it. You don't have the skills, or you're not ready for that. Use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session. I call them strategy sessions because we are going to get clear on two things. One, identify exactly what your challenges are, and two, we are going to give you strategies. We're going to, come up with strategies that would help you address those issues, solve those problems, and make sure that your always-on available groups or your SQL Server high availability solutions would be rock solid, stable, reliable, highly available the way they should be. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This would lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. Okay, use that link, schedule a strategy session, and let's talk. Happy to help in any way I can. Tune in again for another episode of the Practical SQL Server HIDR show. I am your host, Edwin Sarmiento, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next episode.